So in this video, we're going to look at that situation where when the courts do this concretization, they sometimes start to make laws. How far do we allow this? What are the limitations? And the reason why this is important, you'll remember that we spoke a lot about the three arms of government. You've got the judiciary, the legislative and the executive. And the courts are not allowed to encroach too much on the legislative function because that rests with Parliament, for instance. So the question we ask here is, how do we approach this? So if we look at the three different viewpoints on how to interpret text, the text-based viewpoints would say, well, all that we need to do is you look at the clear and unambiguous text of the legislation. What is the intention of the legislature? It's only if the words are ambiguous or inconsistent, then you can use secondary and tertiary aids, but the court is limited to only say what the law is and not make the law. So the court should interpret the legislation only within the framework that the words give them. And that's limited by the power of the legislature. So modifications, if something can't happen, the court must say we cannot interpret it in a certain way. To make the law, we must send it back to the legislature. They alone can fix it. So that's quite a strict approach. Then we have the text in context viewpoint, and the text in context viewpoint, courts think that courts do have a very creative lawmaking function. So the creative role doesn't mean that it just takes over the powers of the legislature. So it doesn't do the work of the legislature, but it accepts that courts do more than just reproduce the plain meaning or the supposed intention of the legislator, the plain meaning of the text or the supposed intention of the legislature. So what courts are supposed to do is to reconstruct the generally framed provisions of the enactment and to apply to concrete situations. So in this instance, there's still a lot of respect for the legislature, and the court must still just construct and interpret but not make laws. But there's a little bit more leeway than in a text-based approach. So they also say that the courts have always had a peripheral, so on the side or subordinate lawmaking function. It is inevitable that the courts are part of this legislative process because it must fulfill the needs of society. So in this process of interpretation, it's inevitable that some of these things will happen. And indeed, the court is a final link in this chain. So you have the lawmaking process that we looked at in the beginning in chapter 3, when it comes into being in the legislature, and it goes along the way. And then at the end, you have the courts, and they are the final chain in this legislative chain. So they are there to ensure that the legislative process has some meaning and has a just end. So many people say legislation is not complete until it is applied. It cannot just hang there in air. It must be applied to be complete. There are also some myths involved with the idea that courts merely interpret the law. Okay, so often in legislation, legal discretion is given to the courts. So if you think of sentencing, for instance, so you get maximum sentencing and minimum, and then within that, the court must exercise a legal discretion within the boundaries and the perimeters of the purpose of the legislation. And they do so every day, and this is also true in interpretation. And also language has limits. The language is not limitless. You can't just describe, you can't read orange and say, well, that clearly also includes grape. It just doesn't. I mean, you can wonder whether it perhaps include like a naartjie or other citrus fruits, but it has limits. And some of these, the legislator will delegate some of these functions to interpret things to the judiciary, especially if it's about a general rule. Okay, so I think instead of seeing the courts as opposition to the legislation, it's really a richer way to see it, would see that they are in partnership, so they work together. The legislature makes the legislation and the courts must finish it off by interpreting it. So interpretation is also a creation of meaning, and they work together. Okay, then there's something that we call the modification or corrective interpretation. What is important here, and this is very, very important because one come across this very often and it confuses a lot of people. So it's not the modification of the language. You don't modify the language. As I said before, you don't say that a orange is a grape. But you modify the meaning of the legislation. You adapt it and reconstruct it during the interpretation to give effect to the purpose of the legislation. And then courts, in any case, cannot amend legislation. It's only the legislature that can amend legislation. So the provision remains, but the meaning is adapted for that specific concrete situation. Okay. The text-based viewpoint can often result also in incorrect or unjustifiable form of judicial lawmaking because the purpose of the legislature is not adhered to. Legislation, sorry. So if you just follow the text-based approach, then you don't give effect to the purpose. That's also a problem. And then came the Constitution, which made all of this even more flexible because it speaks about the constitutional supremacy. So everything must be in line with the Constitution. So courts have even a greater duty nowadays to ensure that the legislation is interpreted in such a way that it is in line with the Constitution. So this doesn't mean that courts just sit there and they think up anything just at their own, having fun there with words. There are certain factors that support, and there are certain factors that limit this judicial lawmaking. So, so where do we draw the line? That's what people often say, this thing, but if we start here, then, any meaning goes. That's also not really true. So it's important to look at these factors. So what are the restrictions? The first one is the principle of democracy. The courts guard the Constitution. They may not take over the constitutional role of the legislature. So if they do that, then you can tell the courts, listen, you have now overstepped the boundaries. You do not have the power to do that. And then I come back to what I said in the beginning, that very important principle of the separation of powers. We have 3 branches in government, and they serve as checks and balances, and sometimes they encroach a little bit. They're not categorically separated. So there are some overlap, but it's fairly minimal, and the principle remains. It's the legislation that makes the legislature that makes the legislation, and the courts then, in this instance, they complete the process by interpretation. Then there's the common law presumption that helps us in this, that legislature does not change existing law more than necessary. We have the rule of law principle, including the principle of legality. So this means that there's adherence to the law, and the law is applicable to everybody, and the law must make sense. Okay. And then very interesting, judicial officers are very accountable. They have, to some extent, they have a personal responsibility because one would hope that most judges will be guided by their own moral guidelines, so they will not go too far because they think it's wrong. Then they also have a formal responsibility, which is the formal constitutional and legislative controls over the judiciary, often to do with how they are appointed as well and how they can be fired. And then, very important, substantive accountability. That's why it's so important to scrutinize the judgment of the court. So you say to the court, well, when the court deliver a judgment, we as the public can debate it and can say, well, you've now gone too far, or that can also guide. And then we as academics, we write academic papers about the interpretation that the court gave, in the hope that maybe one day, when a similar case is in front of them, that it might guide them differently. Penal provisions or restrictive provisions in legislation, as well as the presumption against the infringement of existing rights. Okay, so that will also restrict this judicial lawmaking. Then there are certain factors that support it. We will look a little bit more at the reading down principle in Chapter 9, but so far, if legislation is on the face of it unconstitutional, but it is reasonably capable of a more restricted interpretation, which would be constitutional and valid, such a restricted interpretation should be followed. That simply means if there are two ways to interpret legislation, one which is constitutional, one which is unconstitutional, you follow the one that gives it, that saves it from unconstitutionality. Section 39.2, during interpretation, courts must try to reconcile the aim and the purpose of the legislation with the spirit, purport of the purport of the Bill of Rights. So that gives them some legitimacy to say, well, we have to do this because the Constitution orders us to do so. The Bill of Rights is also the cornerstone of South African democracy. We must respect, protect, promote, and fulfill the Bill of Rights, and this is also binding on the judiciary. So whatever the judiciary does is it must do so in order to promote these values. So Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Okay, so we no longer just listen to what Parliament says. It's not supreme, the Constitution is. So that gives you support this idea. And the common law presumption that the legislature does not intend future meaningless or nugatory legislation. So you can try and save it from being meaningless or nugatory. And then the independence of the judiciary is also very important. They must apply the law fearlessly.